Ahmed is already there. Good. I welcome everybody here in the Academy building or in Linden in Berlin. It's very cold here. And please, and those who have patience and time to listen us out there. This meeting is recorded and will be available in the YouTube channel after a certain period, thanks to Father Martika, who again is responsible of the technical side. Our speaker today does not require so much introduction. Nevertheless, I will say some points about Ahmed al-Rahim. He has received his PhD in 2009 in Yale, is since a couple of years research director of the department in the University of Charlottesville in the state of Virginia in the United States. And currently he gives us the honor to be, has been almost a year or a bit less, 2022. Ahmed was fellow, or still is, a couple of weeks in the Chronoi cluster based in Freie Universität. He is preparing something very interesting about a reflection of historiography, how to evaluate, how to segment periods, and to also to talk perhaps about the impact that these classifications have, if I have correctly understood your research and your activities here. Ahmed al-Rahim is interested in the reception of scholarship, of antique scholarship. Avicenna is his publication. You see this all in this small description on our web. So this, of course, is an important reference point, that we have antique knowledge that is received in Islam, in Arabic, via other languages, but there is a continuity to antiquity in Arabic scholarship, and this of course has relevance when we use categories like late antiquity has become very famous. The late antiquity as period of the Quran of Arabic, if we think about the discussion about Thomas Bauer, and at the same time this might be also to some degree a bit Eurocentristic. Without a bit, it is definitely Eurocentristic in the sense that late antiquity refers to Athens and Rome, and one might wonder if it is always a lucky use of the term when we talk, for instance, about the Quran. In the case of Avicenna and Greek philosophy, it is of course has to be seen from a different side, and I would also agree that it's justified. But let's come back to the topic and to our speaker. Better than to speak about Ahmed al-Rahim is to have him speak here on our floor. The floor is open. Thanks for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Much for the introduction and remarks for inviting me, and my colleague Stefanie Rabe for introducing me to Michael Max. And I'm delighted to be here, and I thank all of you for coming and those who are online. I should just say, yes, Avicenna is an interest of mine, but as my fellow Islamicists know, we tend to do almost everything under the Arabic sun, and or try at least. And one of the things that I'm working on now is notions of the ocular in the Qur'an and the Hadith. This is part of a monograph project that deals with Jahili poetry and notions of vision. It also deals with aspects of optics and the scientific tradition, that is the scientific worldview that I am trying to see whether it shapes how our authors talk about vision. And a number of verses, including one that deals with winking, and there are typologies of winking and different kinds of winking. And so what I hope to do is to bring together as much material on the gaze, on vision, the ocular in Islamic scripture, that is the Quran and the Hadith. Now, to begin, course, Majnoon Layla, right? This is the this image that we have of Majnoon and Layla in this garden. He's gazing at her, and just to quote one line, quote, they said he has been stricken by the gaze of a jinni. Had they only realized, they would have said stricken by the eyes of a human. وَلَوْ قَالُوا بِهِ مِنْ أَعْيُنِ الْجِنِّ نَظَرًا وَلَوْ عَقَلُوا قَالُوا بِهِ أَعْيُنِ الْإِنسِ. Now, in many ways, we have to go back to the pre-Islamic period to see how these terms are developed, but I won't go into that here. Today, I will focus on the protocols of the gaze. The gaze, or the act of seeing the other and the awareness of being seen, has a storied history in the Islamic tradition. In the Qur'an, the gaze, or glance, along with the amorous eye, can you hear me on my projector? Okay. And its attendant curiosity is associated with, quote, the lust of the eye, or, unquote, or, quote, the fornication or adultery, zina al-ayn. Both acts reckoned among the lesser moral lapses or sins, as opposed to the grave in Muslim pietistic and jurisprudential literature. Qur'an 24, verse 30-31 instructs the believing men al-mu'minun and women al-mu'minat to avert their gaze from those of the opposite sex in order to preserve their chastity. Here, attention is drawn to the sexual curiosity attendant on glancing, even momentarily, publicly, or mayhap privately, at the other sex. The Islamic tradition generally warns against, quote, concupiscent curiosity, particularly the incessant male gaze, to which the matter of imposing, quote, modest costume on women to avert that gaze is connected. The indulgence of the gaze is most often presented as an inauspicious step towards perpetrating, that is, the grave sin of fornication or adultery, which may be punishable by lapidation, also the other sin of sodomy, liwat, the effeminate Pathic act, al-mukhannath al-ma'boon, or of pederasty, including that of the catamite, all deemed to be Islamically unlawful sexual acts that, depending on the evidence or a qadi's discretion, may be subject to judicial punishment. In this talk today, I will examine the exegetical literature on chapter 24, verse 30-31, and the concomitant Muhammadan traditions or hadith, exegetical hadith on the gaze as concupiscent curiosity in Islam. I will mainly be looking at Sunni sources. Section 1 deals with the Sitzmleben of these two verses, and it is with regards to a spectacle and an orchard. As to the context of 2431, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who dies in 150-767, in his Hadith commentary on the Quran, tells the story of Asma bint Mushrik, a female companion, Sahabiya, of Muhammad, who with her sister Hind appears in the sources as either free woman, domestic servant, khadim, or slave, mamluk, from among the helpers, the Ansar, of the town of Yathrib. There, on the estate of her clan, the Banu Haritha, she had a date palm orchard, perhaps, something like this, called al-Wa'il. One day, we are told, the women folk who gathered there arrived without veils, غير متواريات, which revealed their cleavage, their bosoms, ma'ala sudurihinna, their legs, rajul, their hair, ash'ar. Shocked and horrified by the spectacle of these women, Asma exclaimed, quote, "Oh, how vulgar is this sight! Ma aqbaha hada." God thereupon revealed to Muhammad, verse 31, translated here with Muqata's glossary. Next slide, please. What I'm going to read now is the translation, partly based on Marbury. And I was lucky enough to be here last week, I think, when we had the Omani Qur'an, which was just released. I do have to say it was a bit difficult getting this. It took me about 20 minutes to figure out how to do it. It's a very complicated, at least for me, process. But in any case, you have it there. That's the new Omani Qur'an. And so what I'll do is I'll read the translation with Muqata's glosses. Quote, and say to the believing women to lower their gaze and to guard their pudenda, and not to reveal their adornments, save those that normally appear, and to draw their veils over their cleavage, and not to reveal their adornments, zina, save to their husbands, their fathers, or their fathers' fathers, or their sons, etc., or what their right hand possesses, ma malakat aymanuhum. That is of male slaves and female slaves, min al-abid, or their male attendants, وَالتَّابِعِينَ غَيْرَ أُولِي الْإِرْبَةِ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ, that is men with no sexual desire for women, or Muqata glosses as مَنْ لَا حَاجَةَ لَهُ فِي النِّسَاءِ, for example, the senile old man, al-Shaykh al-Harim, or the eunuch, al-Qasli, or children who have yet to attain knowledge of a woman's pudenda, awrat al-nisa. That is youthful, prepubescent boys of the man, as-sagar. We'll return to the man. Before whom women may lay down her outer wrapping garments. These categories, these are of course social categories of free and slave men. And let them, the believing women, not stamp their feet, so that the hidden adornments may be known. O believers, all of you turn in repentance to God, so that you may achieve salvation. I hope you're able to see where the glosses were following that. Unquote. Why, and with respect to whom, the attendant verse, Qur'an 24:30, quote, say to the believing men to lower their gaze and to guard their pudenda, that is morally purer, escap for them. God knows what they do, quote, was revealed to Muqata. Muqata does not say anything about this. And the menfolk in question, whose presumable ogling or leering with concupiscent curiosity at the women that day in Asma's orchard, led God to reveal this verse. Withal, failed to make an appearance in the story of Asma's orchard, to say nothing of Muhammad's whereabouts. As for the various parts of a woman's anatomy, quote, that normally appear, unquote, that is, that do not have to be veiled, Muqata says these are the face, which, the two palms of the hand, and kafan, and that part of the body where the two bracelets are worn, mola siwarain, that is, the wrists. The believing woman may then reveal their adornments only to their familial categories and social classes of people arrayed in Qur'an chapter and verse 24:31, before whom they may remove, quote, their outer garments, jalabib, where Muhammad and this is just by comparison, verse 33:59, where Muhammad warns his wives and daughters also to cover themselves in this way. To illustrate the relationship between the master and her slave concerning modesty and privacy, the Shafi'i traditionalist Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, who dies in 1505, quotes on the authority of one of the last companions, Al-Anas ibn Malik, 93, 711, a parabolic hadith. In which Muhammad presents his daughter Fatima, Wahaba laha, with a slave, while she, in the presence of her father and male slaves, is wearing a tunic, thobe, such that when she veils her head with it, that is the tunic does not cover her legs. إذا قنعت به رأسها لم يبلغ رجليها. And when she covers her legs with it, it does not veil her hair or head. When Muhammad saw this sight of Fatima trying to cover those parts of her body, those two parts of her body, he said, do not worry about covering yourself, for it is only your father and your new slave servant, Ghulam. As regards women stamping their feet in the verse to reveal their hidden adornments, Muqatil describes the adornments as anklets, khalakhil, which, when worn and deliberately jiggled, cause a jingling sound, sawt jalajil. In closing his interpretation of 2431, Muqatil reminds his audience that the latter ostentatious behavior of the womenfolk at Asmat's orchard appear to have been intended to attract not only the ocular concupiscent curiosity of the believing men, but also the oral. That both acts enumerated among the misdeeds, the new of the believing women who visited that orchard on that fateful day in Yathrib. Not many commentaries on 2431 tell the story of Asmat's orchard, and Muqatil nowhere cites an authority for the narrative of this occasion of revelation. Asmat's orchard does, however, appear again in slightly reworded and reordered form, mainly in what I'm describing as the Shafi'i tradition of Quranic exegesis. Right? I want to make an argument that I think that there are different traditions of exegesis, and there are certain narratives that are told within the various legal schools from which the exegetes come. And so al-Wahidi, who dies in 468, 1076, in his long commentary al-Siyah, here, the story is reproduced on the authority of Muqatil and his namesake, the hadith transmitter Muqatil ibn Hayyan, who died in 135, 753, who was active in Balkh. Al-Wahidi, using the dual form, refers to both as the two Muqatils, al-Muqatilan. This verse further appears in Shafi'i traditionalist Ibn Kathir, Tafsir al-Raum, who dies in 774, 1373, where Muqatil ibn Hayyan also serves as an authority for the story. But in this narration, he heard it from someone, or possibly read it somewhere, on the authority of the companion Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Khazraj, who dies in 786-97, who, like Asma, was of the helpers. Jabir reports the events of this story that hastened God to reveal 2431. Notwithstanding this companion's authority, Ibn Kathir's audience seemingly left with some doubt about the story's soundness or truth. So, on account of his interjection, Wallahu a'lam, that is, God knows best, before his report. A hesitation not found in al-Wahidi's presentation of the story. Moving now to the question of the concupiscent curiosity and what is described often in tradition as the second glance. In his paraphrastic gloss on Muhammad, cautioning the believing men and women in Quran 24:30-31 to, quote, lower their gaze, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman states that the believers should, quote, avert their gaze entirely from that upon which it is impermissible to gaze, unquote. Relatedly, al-Wahidi quotes the formative Quranic authority Abdullah ibn Abbas, who died 687, Muhammad's first cousin, says that the believers are urged, quote, not to gaze upon that which is not permitted to them. The latter reading, of to lower the gaze, al-Wahidi writes, is the one agreed upon by nearly all exegetes of the Qur'an. al-Mufassiri. In his kitab Ta'wilat al-Qur'an, the theologian al-Maturidi quotes Ibn Abbas, who also says that that the visually represented passive object, and I insert passive here, authorially intended, whence the believers ought to avert their gaze, is nothing except their own carnal desires, shahawat. In contrast to Muqatil and al-Wahidi's laconic glosses on, quote, to lower the gaze, Ibn Kathir provides, citing a catalog of Muhammadan traditions or hadith, a disquisition on the hermeneutics of reverting the concupiscent gaze. Lowering the gaze, he writes, is a divine injunction, either to avert the gaze from or to shut the eyes in the face of that which is prescribed, al-maharim. Ibn Kathir describes glancing or steadily gazing at an intentional act, as an intentional act that embodies the observer's sexual objectification of the passive object. Another type of glance described by Ibn Kathir is the unexpected one, and another al-faj'a or al-fuja'a, when something impermissible catches one's eye unintentionally. Waqa'a al-basaru ala maharim min ghayr qasd, and causes an involuntary sexual arousal. In a hadith, Muhammad is asked, quote, "What say ye of the unexpected glance?" unquote. The questioner, the early Basran orator, Jarir ibn Abdullah al-Bajali, who dies in 675, who converted to Islam shortly before Muhammad died, relays Muhammad's response. Quote, "He instructed me, when the unexpected glance befalls me, to avert my gaze. Amarani and asrufu basari." In other words, this Ibn Kathir explains Muhammad's commanding of Jarir is to, quote, "cast your eyes down to the ground." And so by extension, this is commanded to the believers. Yet in another type of gaze, Ibn Kathir enumerates, in yet another type of gaze that Ibn Kathir enumerates is another version of the second glance here. In a commonly cited hadith, Muhammad says to Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says to him, quote, "O Ali, do not glance twice, la tatba'a al-nadhara al-nadhara, upon that which is forbidden to you. For the pleasure of the first glance is solely your own, whilst the second is not." In the same vein, on the authority of al-Hasan al-Basri, who dies in 728, Muhammad heralds the believers, "O son of Adam, the first glance is yours, while the second is held against you. وَعَلَيْكَ الثَّانِيَةُ." That is, the former, the unexpected glance, though possibly relished, does not involve intent. That is, thus it is not sinful, while the latter involves intent, rendering it sinful. On the matter of the intent of the second glance, the Shafi'i Qadi and political theorist al-Mawardi, who dies in 1058, writes that what is forbidden is not necessarily the second glance, but the intent behind it. That is, the gaze becomes total intentionality, or the constitutive presence of the observer of the observed. The hadith, or the hadith of the first and second glance, are most frequently quoted to curb the male gaze, and feature nearly in all commentaries on 2430. On the warning against the second glance, al-Maturidi says that the second glance is as though the observer did nothing but repeat the first glance over and over again, namely gazing lecherously, the act of which ignites carnal desire and lust, shahwat, in the heart, or that the passive object of the gaze, which is not attainable, sets that desire into motion. On this theme, the Hanafi Samarkandi, who dies in 375-93, quotes a saying attributed to Jesus. Quote, "Beware of the gaze, for its object will be sown in the heart." Unquote. Withal, the metaphorical literary motif of the gaze being a poisoned arrow that pierces the heart is a common one in the commentaries on 2430. In interpreting the dictum, quote, "the gaze is an arrow that poisons the heart," another, Sahm, Samma il-Qalb, ascribed to an anonymous pious father of Islam, one Ba'al as-Salaf, Ibn Kathir says that God, because the concupiscent gaze corrupts the heart, enjoins the believers to guard their credenda and to avert their gaze, in order, that is, to only guarantee against the heart not being entirely corrupted by the gaze. In a related tradition, quote, gaze at the charms of a woman, gazing at the charms of a woman, Muhammad reportedly said, is a poisoned arrow of Iblis, unquote. In an apparent hadith Qudsi, a category of attributed to God, Muhammad spoke, God spoke, quote, "the gaze is a poisoned arrow from Iblis's quiver, whoever refrains from gazing out of fear, I will exchange that averted gaze with him. For a faith whose sweetness he shall discover in his heart." On the same theme of sweetness of faith, Muhammad reportedly said, "Should any Muslim glance upon a woman's charms, but thereupon averts his gaze, God will reward him with devotional service, ibadah, whose sweetness he shall discover." Unquote. Concerning the coda of 2430, quote, "God knows what they do," and Wahidi writes, "God's omniscience encompasses his knowledge of what particular acts the believing men commit with their agenda, or which objects they direct their gaze." In a Qur'an interpretation, Ibn Kathir writes that the meaning of this coda is found in Qur'an 40:19. Quote, "God knows the treachery of the eyes, and what the breasts conceal, tukhfi as-sudur." In the commentary literature on 40:19, Ibn Abbas is quoted to have said that the treachery of the eyes consists of the second glance. That is, its corruption of the heart is concealed by the bosom. Expanding on the latter point and on the nature of God's omniscience, Ibn Kathir recalls an illustrative story involving stolen glances reported on the authority of Ibn Abbas, telling of a man who visits a family at al-Bayt with whom a beautiful hasna woman catches his eyes. Catches his eyes. Whenever the family, amid his visit, was unmindful of him, the man would observe the woman, and when they noticed, he would avert his gaze or furtive gaze from her. God then became cognizant of this man's heart, of this man's heart's desire to, that is, behold her credenda. That is, the concupiscent curiosity the man conceals from his hosts is in full view of God. Mentioned there also among the treacheries of the eye, of which God is cognizant, is the wink. I won't get into to that too much, which is elaborated quite a bit in the Hadith literature, and that appears in Quran 83:30, where Muhammad scorns the non-believers for mocking the believers by winking at each other as they pass them. And the Shafi'i Thalabi, who dies in 427-1035, also on the authority of Abu Huraira, 57-67, reports a story about a man who is praying when a woman saunters by him, drawing his gaze, whereupon he follows her with his eyes. Atba'a اتبعها بصره. While continuing to pray. As the story goes, he, because of this act, that is following her while praying, lost his eyesight. He went blind. In considering the gaze, Ibn Kathir, in the company of other exegetes, employs language that is that is with respect to sins, where those acts of failing to abide by God's commandments, that is to preclude the gaze from being concupiscently curious and to guard the pudenda against committing adultery and fornication, are sufficient causes and reasons for depravity and corruption of the heart. More generally, Ibn Kathir's psychology and hermeneutics of the concupiscent gaze also refers to Islamic classifications of sins and indicates by extension some of the vices and virtues of the believers who belong to the Islamic polity or Ummah. Now, the objects of the concupiscent gaze. In a hadith regarding the gaze and the pastime of people watching, Ibn Kathir cites Muhammad warning his companions, quote, "Beware of street loitering," to which they responded, "O Apostle of God, but it is inescapable that our gatherings, majalis, take place there, where we may converse with each other." Muhammad replied, quote, "If you insist on gathering in the street, then give the street its due." To which they said, quote, "And what right is due to the street, haqq al-tariq, O Apostle of God?" He therewith announced unto them the following public obligations. Quote, averting the gaze, avoiding trouble, replying to the salutations of peace be with you, but the salam, and commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, of course, which is discussed extensively. What this hadith attempts to do, among other things, is to regulate the public gaze, particularly that of the male and between the sexes. In the exegetical hadith on the gaze, the public gaze is differentiated from the permissible private, even concupiscent gaze that is described as necessary in the context of, quote, demand in marriage or betrothal among Muslim free men or slaves, and when purchasing a slave, but especially a concubine. Apart from the male to female gaze, Ibn Kathir addresses the matter of the male gaze directed towards handsome, beardless youth. Next image, please. I'll explain this in a second. It needs explanation. Let's see. Beardless youth or prepubescent boys as regards the public duty of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. He says emphatically, indicating that this pedophilic practice was familiar to the earliest Muslims, that the pious forefathers, the Salaf, would stop men from fixing their gaze upon the beardless youth. An obligation that is not, Ibn Kathir observes, followed by all masters of Sufism and mental Sufiyya. Ibn Kathir here is referring to the mystical pedophilic practice and theory of shahid-bazi, or playing the witness. As for the practice, this involves the Sufi spiritual sama, accompanied by the litany. This then is followed by contemplation of divine beauty in the earthly form of a handsome, beardless youth, who has been especially adorned for this occasion as a witness, as a shahid to God, whose beauty in their eyes represents that of God. So, as for the theory of shahid-bazi, some Sufi masters postulated that based on the theosophical thesis that the deity manifests itself in humanity, al-hulul al-lahut fil nasut, God causes himself to be reincarnated in the form of the boy witness. The worldly love of or infatuation with beardless youth is then for the postulant, murid, a prerequisite to realizing the eternal true love of God. The ambiguity here between platonic and carnal love is left for the audience to consider. We can just go to the next one. You'll see here, this is a Sanat session. You see the gazing here of the top window of the man looking into the boy's eyes. Yeah, and the next one. Yeah, and this is another image that is Shah Abbas there, gazing into a boy's eyes. Now, guarding the gaze, guarding against the gaze. As for the second injunction, that the believers guard their pudenda in Quran 24:30, and 31, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman writes that to acquit oneself of this obligation, as well as the former, that is to lower or avert the gaze from the objects of concupiscent curiosity, is more virtuous, than not doing so, because if the concupiscent gaze is not averted, it may lead to the male and female pudenda being unprotected against the enormity of the sin of adultery or fornication. This, Muqatil writes, is what is meant by, quote, that is morally pure for them, namely the believing men addressed in 24:30. Consonant with Muqatil and Wahidi glosses, quote, guarding the pudenda with, quote, against acts of fornication, which he writes is the interpretation of the majority of exegetes. In juxtaposition with the latter interpretation, al-Wahidi provides an exegetical narration, riwayah, ascribed to Ibn Mihran, who dies around 9709, a client and first generation successor of the companions, on the authority of Rabi' ibn Anas, which states, quote, every Quranic verse that addresses the guarding of the pudenda intends them to be guarded against acts of fornication or adulterous acts, save the verse which means that the pudenda should be covered lest any one see them. That is the objects of, that is that it be an object of the gaze. Al-Wahidi, Al-Wahidi says that Aliya's explanation, ta'wil, of the elided prepositional phrase in the Quranic verse is the soundest. Now, Ibn Kathir quotes the following two traditions. The first is a Muhammadan intercessory hadith from al-Bukhari: whosoever guards that which is between his beard and between his legs out of respect for me, I will guarantee him eternity to heaven. Which is to say, salvation is offered to those who neither speak lies nor commit adultery or fornication. The second tradition is given on the authority of the prominent companion Ibn Mas'ud, who dies around 32-652, who reports that Muhammad declared, quote, every eye on the day of judgment shall weep, save the eye averted from the gaze upon that which God forbids. The eye that passed the night awake for the sake of God, doubtless performing the supererogatory nightly prayers, and the eye that secretes even something as insignificant in size as the head of a fly. This is something I'm interested in, flies, and they keep reoccurring in different places, the significance of flies. مثل رأس الذباب من خشية الله. Additionally, Ibn Kathir, on the authority of Abu Hurairah, quotes Muhammadan tradition on the fatalism of human beings committing, among other things, transgressions of adultery and fornication. Quote, the destiny of a human being, Ibn Adam, to commit the sins of adultery or fornication, which doubtless he will, has been preordained. For adultery or fornication of the eye is the act of the gaze, of the tongue, the act of speech, of the ears, eavesdropping, of the hands committing violence, of the feet trespassing, and of the soul desiring and coveting. whereby the pudenda will confirm that is the act of adultery or deny it with the resurrection. That is, if one acted on the curiosity of the concupiscent gaze. In this hadith, the pudenda not only serves as the external genitalia, that is the organ with which the prescribed sexual intercourse is performed, the means through which the concupiscent wish behind the gaze is realized, but also bears witness to the act and thus to its perpetrator on the day of judgment. So, to conclude, in the medieval Islamic tradition, the preoccupation with the gaze largely centers on the role, on its role in concupiscent curiosity and romantic love. Much of this discourse on the gaze has been generated by the hermeneutics around 2431 of the Qur'an with respect to averting the public gaze of men and the veiling of free women's bodies as a technique for achieving the latter. The gaze and the bodies of slaves, concubines, eunuchs are not strictly regulated as that of free men. The differentiation or alterity within the private and public realms serve to identify as a social marker the legal and economic status of free men and slaves. As for the female gaze, the commentators on 2431 generally address it with reference to the public modesty and morality, as well as the sexual dignity of free women, particularly. The primary exegetical theme associated with 2431 includes first the impertinent gaze of the concupiscent eye and its carnal corruption of the heart. Two, the virtues of averting the gaze, the vice of gazing. Three, the objects of the furtive gaze. Four, love madness, ishq, as we have in the first slide, and the motif of, quote, the romantic fool, the unassuageable bondservant of the amorous gaze. Going back to, if you go back to the first slide, you'll see there, the first one, yeah. You'll see there Walayla and the idea of gazing at her in the date garden. Lastly, there is little, if any, discussion in the exegetical literature 2431 of the gaze as a mental event, that is, of a morally discrete order that is distinct from that of a physical act. Islamic theology, for instance, wherein acts of the heart, al-qulub, like volition, irada, ratiocination, also nadar, are categorically distinct from the limbs of al-jawarih, such as motion. This taxonomy and nomenclature with which medieval Quranic exegetes examine the concupiscent curiosity of the gaze is then mainly that of Islamic hermetology and law, inasmuch as the interiority of the gaze is made indistinguishable from the corporal action. Thank you very much. Just the last slides, just
thank you very
second
much.
To last.
Now we have to explore the technical side now for the discussion.
One more. Sorry. Just yeah, last one.
Next one.
Yeah, next one. Perfect. Yeah. Another one shall pass and final.
Can you explain this one? What do we see here?
Okay, so here we see, of course, the man or the prepubescent boys dressed as girls or women in the court, and yeah, this was not necessarily a Sufi sana or anything, but this was part of the court culture, and often, particularly among the Safavids, you had this feature of the man present at the court as an indication of the sultan's authority and
And this is the Iranian.
Yeah, it's a Persian.
Iran, Persian.
Yeah, Persian.
Which from when?
This is the
17th?
16th century. I can look them up, but this is about 17th century.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then the last one, which is I think also from the 17th century. This this is another Safavid, Suleiman, the first. Here you also have this odd sort of what appears to be a Dutchman, a young boy there, and again, sort of no female attendants here. They all appear to be young boys, and again, this was one way I think of asserting his power, and authority, and wealth, depicting it in these Persian miniatures. There's a whole aspect of the art history of this that
Well, thank you for this this attempt to map out the exegetical tradition in combination with juridical schools. The term Shafi'i tafsir is interesting. I don't know. How do we proceed technically in discussion? Can you hear me? I mean, people outside there, I don't know.
turn off the sound.
Oh, you can also. Should I come to the micro, or how should we do in the?
You can just say it here.
Okay, very
There's a
good.
microphone.
Yeah. So, thank you very much for this, and the floor is open for questions here in Berlin. And I just see Alba Fideli, and I'm very happy to see her again because she was giving the annual lecture last week. Exactly, Devin Stewart is here. Welcome, and Nora Schmidt from Hamburg. Excellent. Yeah, so floor is open, and please, and you are collecting also if there are people on the screen who want to ask a question.
I have
Speak up.
something. Yes. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. It's also a really, like what I find interesting is how sort of certain parts of the body commit certain acts, and like certain sins are associated with certain parts, and etc. Oh, but now I was just wondering, like, you have said a lot about the gaze as an active thing, like the sins committed by projecting your gaze towards something, and specifically in a sexual context. I was wondering whether there was something related to the act of attracting the gaze. And I remember that, if I'm not mistaken, I was looking for it, but I couldn't find it really quickly. If I remember correctly, at the end of Surah Al-Alaq in the 96, it says something regarding, it complains about those who try to attract the gazes of the others in order to be seen praying. So I was just wondering whether you have explored that of not of the active gaze, but of the gaze, or those people who tend to who try to attract the
Those who
gaze
seek to be the
to
objects
others.
of the gaze. Those who seek to be the objects
Yes,
of the gaze
exactly,
by
yeah.
performing public acts of piety.
Oh
Prayer.
yes, like that's the context of the Surah Al-Alaq, but perhaps in this, because you were speaking about Surah An-Nur,
Yeah.
so there is perhaps something related to sexually sort of attracting the gaze.
Well, I mean, in 24:30:31, women are described as wearing anklets, right, which make a particular noise, right? So those are there to draw the attention of men. Or they are not covering properly, or their decollage is exposed or something. All of these are physical, either acts or parts of the body that draw the concupiscent gaze. So, yeah, and in terms of prayer, well, there's an entire literature on Riya, that is this public performance for which one wants to be acknowledged, for his or her piety, and a lot of that literature focuses on intentionality. But I think you bring up a very interesting point as to, I mean, there's a lot of literature on it in sort of critical French theory about the object, Sant, and others. But basically, yeah, I mean, what role do we play? When are we the object and when are we the subject? And I think that you're muddying my picture up a little bit, but I think that is something that I should think about in terms of, yeah, when the object wants to become subject of the gaze, or yeah, the interaction between these two things, because it's often not clear. And I will, yeah, I will look at that verse and sort of.
Yes, thank you. I have a question on the same lines. I was wondering now, Marion Katz's book, Women in the Mosque, which has introduction about exactly these problems. Everything revolves around the notion of fitna, so seduction. And she analyzes this in different sources, and it depends also not only on the opportunity to see people and to be seen, but also on the age of women and also the time of the day. So you can go to the mosque at night because nobody can see you properly. Do you find these kind of things in this interpretation? So the notion of fitna, especially.
You know, fitna never, at least in the exegetical literature that I looked at, I tried as much as I could. This was, of course, done during COVID, done archived resources. But yeah, a lot of this literature does not necessarily mention fitna explicitly, but it does mention, it does refer to, or at least it places the blame on women. I mean, certainly the Qur'an places the blame on women. It does not refer to the men. We don't know where Muhammad was. We don't know who was ogling these women. You know, I mean, the story as it's told, right? And so so often the exegetes yeah, I think the fitna is implicit in in talking about covering certain parts. I mean, as early as Muqatil, parts of the woman's body. But of course, you know, this doesn't apply to slaves and slave women. Slave women, for example, can cover as much as a man. That is from their breasts, for example, can be exposed if what they're wearing gets in the way of their work, but effectively from below the breast to the knees, the exact same covering for men. So there are these different categories, and I think one thing that I've noticed about a lot of the literature, you know, looking at it, there's very little discussion of slavery. I mean, people assume that, you know, when the Quran talks to the believers, it includes slaves and others, and it's all, there's a kind of egalitarian notion. But I think, particularly, yeah, verse 24, I mean, rather 24:31, is very explicit about the social categories. And I think those are very important in terms of how, in terms of the history of covering and uncovering, and perhaps of fashion as well.
Just to get this clear, can you repeat this explicitly? Social categories for 24:31. What do you mean precisely? Just to get this clear. Very
Yeah, I mean, can we go back to the verse? It's right. It's all there.
if I
And
understand correctly, you say-
of course, provides all of the losses for it, right? And so here we have, so for example, units, he says, I mean, all of this is perhaps interpretive, but perhaps there, of such men as attend them or not having sexual desire, right? Servants. Right? Servants, yeah, and presumably those would have been slaves, one kind or another. There's a story, of course, of Muhammad bringing a slave to Fatima, right? This hadith about a gift, and the story is illustrative of what in front of whom a woman should cover. I mean, the purpose of the story is that she does not have to cover her hair or her knees in front of the slave. Father, that he basically has the same status as a family member in terms of those things. So, yeah, so I think those two categories of freedmen, bondsmen, I think are important in terms of they're not metaphorical, perhaps in Sufism they may be, but these were categories that were very important, I think, for how most importantly people publicly displayed themselves either as objects or subjects.
So I just thought that one way to look at the gaze might be to think about social interaction. So when you are interacting in society, you have to, the first thing you do is you see each other, right? So there's a element of reciprocity, right? That is not, it seems like this is a little different from when it discusses greetings in the Quran. To me, if you look at greetings in the Quran, it seems like they are used as a model for all social speaking to each other. I mean, it says when you are greeted, you have an obligation to return the greeting, right? And it has to be the same or above. You have to do, it can be equal or escalation. But this seems to be contradictory because, when someone looks at if you follow the analogies, if someone looks at you, well, you have to look at them, right? But then it doesn't say that. So I'm just asking you, what do you think about that? Do you think that why is there such a difference? And if you compare the two, does that get you anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the public morality, particularly in that hadith, where loitering and people watching and all of these things, right? One of them is Radd salam, right? And then, as you know, there's an entire literature about what kind of salam do you to a Christian. If someone is riding a horse and someone is walking, there are different sorts of exchanges with the what someone is riding has to say to a pedestrian walking, etc. And how we greet Jews, Christians, and others, right? All of that is there. As far as the gaze, there isn't any injunction that you have to look at the other person when they look at you, right? But I think it is. It really is based on gender, right? So it's really about how genders interact publicly, right? And as you know very well, Islamic law is largely about the public realm. It's not really concerned very much with, it assumes some concern with people's private lives, but largely, at least in the pre-modern world, it was about public morality and maintaining some sort of public order. And the gaze was one of those things that it wanted to relegate, or that is provide protocols for the gaze. So if I'm understanding your question, I think that that greetings are different, and often it's not encouraged for men to greet women. Right, to convey the greetings to women. I'd have to look at that though in more detail, but I think it's divided along sex.
Thanks, thank you very much. The last, well, maybe not the last one, but the question with regard to the reference to antiquity that sometimes was our topic in our discussions in Berlin. Is there any description or reference, or could there be any reflection, discussion about the gaze in preceding or neighboring textures, colony cultures that you have met or encountered that could serve as a reference point for kind of prehistory of what you have been describing to us today?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, for example, the idea that Iblis would shoot arrows right into the heart of one who gazes, that causes them to fall in love, or perhaps even unjustifiably fall in love without the right conditions, right? Yeah, all of these have references to playful motifs of eros, this bow and arrow in classical Greek literature. So much of this is appropriated, but instead of eros, we have, Iblis, and so I found that part very interesting. That those metaphors, that mythology, right, is somehow appropriated within an Islamic context, but almost the opposite of how it is often used within the classical tradition.
Okay.
Opposite in the sense that, you should not engage in gazing at someone, because then this will bring about, possibly lead to the act of fornication, and hence Iblis, Iblis's bow and arrow, and the bow striking the heart, so on. So yeah, there is a kind of richness in the exegetical tradition, and yeah, and I think that was just generally part of the culture of late antiquity, and how it's just, Islam simply is an extension culturally of those traditions. I mean, even the pederasty and this the gazing at young boys, relationship between older men and younger and prepubescent boys. I mean, all of this has a long history that goes back, of course, to the Greeks and Plato. And so, yeah, Islam simply in many ways appropriates this, or perhaps appropriate is too strong, but certainly culturally these things are continuous.
Visually, the examples you were showing in your presentation were all from the Iranian world, if that's correct. Yeah.
Well,
Why?
I mean, it's difficult to say the Iranian. I mean, for example, one of the most famous proponents of Shahid Bazi is Ghazali's brother, Ahmed Ghazali. Right, and he talks about this quite a bit, and so there's a lot of literature on Sohrawardi and others, the Sufi, about either critiquing it or allowing it, but often it's assumed that there was no physical intercourse of any kind, that these were simply ways in which God's beauty was objectified, in the form of but these practices continue to the present. Afghanistan and other places. Yes.
Me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, I was just wondering, because I think you mentioned it at some moment, that this is also a topic in love treatises outside, let's say, morality. So let's say, for example, in Ibn Hazm, there's a lot of the point of falling in love because of having this kind of gaze. Would you expand a bit on that, and how far this is connected to each other?
Yeah, good question. I have not looked at. I mean, some may I have not looked, I mean, I'm aware of that literature but that literature often has very little to do with Quranic material and
It's
the
true.
hadith, and it often has to do with romantic love. So in many ways, one can be connected to the pre-Islamic period, in terms of romantic love and other things. I will have to look at this question of whether gazing appears in that. I would have to go back and look, but I think it's an interesting comparison. But one, at least as far as this project of looking at the Quran and the Hadith, I have not found anything so far. But it may be the case that there are Quranic verses that are quoted in that literature, or Hadith that are quoted, and I think that's a good
Well,
point.
At least Ibn Hazm ends with a very moral chapter in the end.
Mm.
So, and probably I didn't look at that, but maybe and at that moment he like quotes a bit from that. So the first chapters are not like that, but the end of the treatise is like very much about morality, and maybe that's there. I don't know, and I was just wondering.
Yeah. I will make a note and look into that. Thank you.
Is there any other questions outside? So then I think we should close this session. Thank you again for introducing this topic, a topic that in our project we have never looked so far into. And of course, to this attempt to map the exegetic tradition. Thank you very much for this. Now, yes, we can continue the discussion